Hello everybody, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Reformed GGA, and I'm here to do the next video in the series on double action, single action autoloaders. This video is somewhat going to be a tutorial on how to select a handgun, but not. You see, I'm rather reticent to give positive advice of what you should do because your situation is going to be different. You're not me. Your physical characteristics are not like mine. What could be a big issue for you might not be the same things that are big issues for me, and so it's really hard to have a one-size-fits-all kind of set of recommendations. So instead of doing that, I'm basically going to tell you the process that I went through in the hopes that you'll be able to glean some useful information from it. So what I'm basically going to do here is tell you about the guns that I bought for myself, the handguns that I bought for myself, and what I learned worked for me and what I learned didn't. So, starting off with the very first handgun that I bought for myself, a CZ75 Compact. And the reason why I bought it was basically that the gun felt good. You hold it in the hand, it's got a very comfortable grip. Very nice. And by the way, all these guns that I'm going to be showing you guys have already cleared off camera. But the trigger pull on it was fairly decent for a stock trigger and a relatively inexpensive gun. So, fairly smooth double action pull. And then the single action pull is very crisp. And so I'm sitting there in the gun store and it feels good. And I also like the fact on it that it has a very high slide, so when I grip the gun, there's very little chance of the slide interfering with my hands or hurting me or something like that. Had a good tang on the backside to protect the back of my hand from coming up and meeting the hammer or the slide or anything like that. So, very comfortable gun. The trigger pull was decent, maybe not the greatest in the world, but a very decent trigger pull. And I like the positioning of the slide, very high slide. I like the tang on the back end to protect the back of my hand. All those things seemed like a good purchase at the time. And today I still like this gun. Part of it is just because this was my first ever handgun, and so there's a certain amount of emotional attachment there. And then there's also some historical significance there as well, as that this is a CZ75, and that is a classic handgun. Now, technically, this is not an original. This is the CZ75 Compact, and so it's not quite the original, but it still kind of has the original vibe to it. Like when people get 1911 clones. Not technically original 1911, or they might get a modified version of the 1911, like the Colt Defender or something like that. Yeah, that's not really how the 1911s were originally made, but it still kind of has that vibe. Same thing with this one. It's not technically an original CZ75, but it's close enough that it still has the vibe and it's still pretty cool. Okay, so I still like it, but I quickly found out that I'm not overly effective with it. There are times where I took it out and I could only hit the target board, not the target itself, but the target board, could only hit it with about half the shots that were in the gun. That's not overly great. But at the time I say, hey, I know that I'm not good at shooting handguns, I know that I'm recoil sensitive and I have vision issues and all those kinds of things. So I basically said, well, handguns suck and I'm going to spend most of my time with my rifles. Sound like a great plan at the time. This is just kind of backup. Now, I'll carry it around just to say that I have it, but yeah, not overly great with it. Probably not the best mentality to have, but when you have a gun that you can't really hit with, it's pretty easy to become discouraged. Now, as time went on, I started becoming more invested in 9mm because I had a number of carbines that were in 9mm as well. And so I start becoming a little bit more interested in what 9mm can and cannot do. And it turns out that it's a somewhat versatile round. It's not overly powerful or anything like that. It's, there are definitely rounds out there, handgun rounds out there that are definitely more powerful, but it is versatile. And in looking into things, I found out that if I had a handgun with a little bit longer barrel, I could get up to a level of performance, ballistic performance, that I was really interested in with particular rounds, and particularly things like barrier penetration, those kinds of things. and so I looked into getting a handgun that had a little bit longer barrel. Well, I might not be any more accurate with it than the last one, but hey, at least if I do hit something, it's going to be that much more effective, because longer barrel, increased ballistic performance. Well, if I do actually hit something, at least that part will be better. And the gun that I picked was another CZ, because I really like the high slides on CZs. It was a CZ P09, this gun right here. And this gun is considerably larger than the other one. My CZ75 Compact is indeed a compact. It has a barrel that is between 3.5 and 4 inches. That's basically a compact size gun. Whereas my CZ-P09 has a barrel that's over 5 inches long, and so that would actually not only make it a full-size handgun, but technically this one is a beyond full-size handgun. Over 5 inches is typically considered beyond full size. So it's a pretty big handgun by comparison. But I wasn't really any more accurate with it, at least not to start off with. The very first time I went and tested it, I actually was shooting really, really, really low. And that's a classic sign of recoil sensitivity. It manifests in shot anticipation, where you know the gun's about to go off, and right before it goes off, you push the gun down because you're trying to compensate for the recoil that you know is going to happen. So you're really sensitive to recoil, it bothers you, and it manifests as shot anticipation. Right before the shot goes off, you push out, which winds up pushing the barrel down, and it can really affect your shots. With this gun, when I first got it, I was sometimes shooting as much as 14 inches low, which is not overly useful. You know, I really hope that my assailant is not sitting down, because if he is, I might shoot under the chair. You know, not good. 14 inches low is pretty ineffective. But like I said, at the time, I'm sitting there going, you know, I know I'm recoil sensitive and those kinds of issues, and I just can't seem to get around it. You know, it is what it is, and kind of went along for a little while just saying, well, handguns suck. I have one with a longer barrel, and if I ever hit anything with it, it'll be more effective because of that. But yeah, handguns suck. But at the same time, it still nagged at me that I wasn't doing any better with handguns. And so eventually I got to a point where I just said, I'm tired of it all. I want something that I can actually get hits with. So I went out and got myself a PMR-30, and I'm not necessarily recommending this gun because it does have some reliability issues. There are things that you can do to mitigate those reliability issues, and I talk about that in other videos. For example, my video on the C, as in cat, the CMR-30, which is the big brother to the PMR-30, in that video I talk about some of the issues with the magazine and some things that you can do to it to make it more reliable. And those apply to the PMR-30 as well. So if you want to look that up, it's there. But not a blanket recommendation that I would make for this gun. But the reason why I got it is because the round that it shoots is a lot softer in terms of recoil. This one fires 22 Magnum rounds. 22 Magnum, like I said, in a semi-auto, not the most reliable thing, but it does have the advantage of having a relatively light recoil. The bullet weight on this one that I fire, for the rounds that I normally fire out of this, are about 30 grains, compared to my real handguns firing the 9mm. There will be people who would argue whether or not 9mm really counts as a handgun round or not, but the typical ammo that I fire through them is 115 or 124 grain. So going down to 30 grain, that is a lot smaller. So much easier to manage. And I was able to get hits with this right out of the box. I was actually able to get hits within a decent sized target zone. I wasn't 14 inches low anymore. I could actually aim at the targets, and as long as the target wasn't, you know, totally minuscule, I could actually hit the thing, and it was great. And practice and practice and practice with it, and I got better and better and better. And eventually I got to the point where I was doing pretty good. Let's see here. This one over on the left-hand side is one of my PMR-30 targets. And this is a 12-shot group, and you can see there's one flyer over there, and that is most certainly me. There are some shots that I just throw, and it's because I pull the trigger when I shouldn't. I know that I'm off, and I still pull the trigger anyways, which is dumb on my part, but that is not reflective of the gun. That's me. But as you can see, most of the shots are inside the center ring, either in it or touching it. And there's a couple of shots. There's one over here and one on the far side that are outside of that center ring and not touching them, or not touching that center ring, but most of them are inside of the center ring. And this was a target fired at 10 yards, and that center ring is 2.5 inches. So the vast majority of my shots inside of a 2.5 inch ring or touching the 2.5 inch ring, that's pretty good. That's pretty workable. That made me feel happy. I was actually happy to go out and shoot the handgun because I could actually hit something with it. And so for a long time, I actually wound up carrying this as my defensive pistol, not because it was overly reliable. I got it to the point where it was reliable enough, but still not overly reliable. But the main thing was that I could hit with it. And for a lot of people who have not developed a whole lot of skill with handguns, doing something like this, I'm not saying this gun in particular, but doing something where you get a gun that is relatively low recoil and easy to manage allows you to get hits. And this gun, in terms of getting hits, was really great. Low recoil, and then also the trigger pull on this one is exceptionally light. The trigger pull on it is only like 2.5 to 3.5 pounds. It's a very light trigger pull, and it also has a stop built into an over travel stop, and that tends to make the overall experience fairly crisp. So it's a light trigger, and you're not overextending it because it has a built-in stop on it. So it tends to be right there. You have a pretty good idea of how much pre-travel there is, and then you get into it, it breaks pretty crisply. It does have a little bit of a plasticky feel because it is a plastic trigger and it is a plastic gun, but still very light, 2.5 to 3.5 pounds, and very crisp. And for some people, having a very light trigger in combination with a very light recoiling round, like 22 Magnum or 22 LR, those kinds of things allows you to get the hits and make it accurate. Now, are those kinds of rounds ideal self-defense rounds? Not really, but I will take something that I can get hits with over something that I can't get hits with anytime, especially compared to my original gun, my CZ75 Compact. Compared to this one, like I said, half the time I couldn't even hit the board that the target was on. Versus this one, where the vast majority of my shots were all within a 2.5 inch circle. And it's pretty easy to figure out which one I'm going to feel more confident with. Are these rounds super effective? No, but they'll actually hit the target. That's kind of an important thing. So for a long time, this is what I carried. And then I started playing around with it and started figuring out what made things better and also what made things worse. And I eventually found out that some of the qualities that I initially looked at as being important weren't really all that important. Like I said, in my CZ75 Compact, when I first got it, one of the things that attracted me to it was it has a really comfortable grip. The PMR30, on the other hand, does not. Take a look at the grip profile there. You see it's actually very triangular. It narrows at the front end. And that is kind of a weird grip to hold on to. It's not uncomfortable, but it's not overly comfortable either. But I did find that there was ways that I could hold it that made it more effective. And so even though it wasn't a very comfortable grip, I did find ways to make it an effective grip. And that's when I figured out that comfortable and effective are not the same thing. CZ75 Compact, very comfortable grip, but not very effective. And the grip that I found that was effective on this gun didn't translate very well over to this one in its stock configuration. Now, there are things that I could do to this gun to make it more effective for me, and in the future I might look at that. But in its stock configuration, even though it has a really comfortable grip, it's not an effective one. The PMR30, not very comfortable, but very effective grip. That was a big difference that I found. Another issue that I found is the sights. The PMR30 has some fiber optic sights, has a fairly large notch in the back, and the front sight is fairly high off of the gun. And that combination tends to be relatively easy for me to pick up and use. And so I found that that actually was a major improvement for me and allowed me to get good shots. And when I compared it to my first handgun that I bought for myself, found out that the sights on this one are actually kind of awful. The notch in the back is not very deep, and then the front sight does not come off of the gun very high at all. And then it's technically a 3-dot sight, but the dots have begun to fade on this one, and so these sights on this gun are really hard for me to pick up. PMR 30, the sights are much brighter, the notch is cut much more deeply, the front sight is much higher off of the gun, makes the PMR 30 sights much more effective for me. And me, I have vision issues. Not only do I have being able to see at distance kinds of issues, but I also have eye dominance issues, or which eye is doing the primary seeing will flip from time to time. That causes some real issues at the range, let me tell you. And so having a good pair of sights is pretty much essential, but my first handgun, my CZ75 Compact, does not have a great pair of sights on it. So I found that that was an issue for me. And so I started applying some of these kinds of things that I was learning to my other CZ, my CZ P09, the full-size one that I got because I wanted the added ballistic performance. Started applying those things to it, especially using a different grip on it and things like that. And I also noticed that the sights on this one, which were much more similar to my PMR 30, to the 22 Magnum. The notch on the rear sight is nice and deep, it's very square cut. The front sight is much higher on this one off of the gun, so it's easier to pick up, and then the dots are still very clearly visible. Even though the lighting in here is not great for seeing it, you can see at least the dots on the rear sights pretty well, and the front one's not bad either. Much more effective sights on this one. Combine that with the more effective grip that I learned from the PMR 30, I found out that I was actually able to do pretty well with this gun, and that actually really surprised me. Let me show you how well I actually did turn out to do. So this is one of my P09 targets. This gun right here. This is really interesting because the score, now this is only a 6-shot group, the one that I showed you for the PMR 30. Bring that one back up here. PMR 30, that's a 12-shot group, so obviously there's going to be more holes. But numerically, this one is the same as the P09. Okay, this was a 6-shot group, but when I do my scores, I just do the average of all of them together multiplied by the distance. And so this one came out to be a 94, the other one came out to be a 94. The vast majority of the shots are inside of the 10 ring, inside of that 2.5-inch circle. Had one flyer out there, that was definitely me. I pulled the shot, pulled the trigger when I should not have. I wasn't ready for it. There's sometimes when you shoot and you pull the trigger and you know you're off and it goes off. And yeah, it's just wrong. That's a bad on me. That's not the gun's fault at all, any way, shape, or form. That's just me pulling the trigger when I shouldn't have. But the vast majority of them, you can see, are inside of the 10 ring. Fairly effective hits, and one of them, well, it's actually 2 of them, 2 that are very close together, pretty close to the bullseye. That's really not bad at all. And that allowed me to figure out something else that I didn't know. In comparing the PMR 30 and my original handgun, I found that the way that I was gripping was important and the sights were important. And then when I started applying those things to the P09, the full-size 9mm handgun, I found out something else that was interesting, and that was that the trigger pull did not matter nearly as much as I thought it did. The PMR 30, like I said, has a very light, crisp trigger pull. 2.5 to 3.5 pound trigger pull. That's pretty cool. That's great. And when I was first learning how to use a handgun effectively, having something like this was nice. Relatively light recoil, very light, crisp trigger pull, really helped compensate for a lot of the problems that I was having. But once I got more comfortable with the guns and I figured out that it's not so much the weight of the trigger pull, but how you pull the trigger that's more important, I was able to get this thing to run just as effectively as the other. And you saw the target. It was the one with the 6 shots. And 5 out of those 6 shots were all in the 10 ring. And this one has a terrible trigger by comparison. There's a lot of people that I've handed this to in double action mode with the trigger forward. This thing is awful. It's like a 10 to 12 pound pole, and it's very gritty, very stagey. It eventually goes off. Awful trigger pull. Now, in single action, it's better, 4 to 5 pound, but still kind of gritty and stagey. And when I do those groups, if I'm practicing with a double single action gun, two of the shots will be in double action mode. What happens is I basically start, if I can, from the holster with it in its holstered configuration, which would be hammer forward, draw it, fire 3 shots, and then decock the hammer, reholster it, draw again, fire 3 shots. The first one of those 3 shots will be a double action pull. So in that group of 6 that I had, 2 of them were double action pulls. And some people might wonder if that flyer out there was one of the double action pulls. It wasn't. Both of the double action pulls are in here. They're inside the 10 ring. That wasn't. That was just me being stupid and pulling the trigger when I shouldn't have. That was a flyer caused by me. So what I found is that the trigger weight really isn't that important. How you pull the trigger is important, but the trigger weight in and of itself really isn't that important at all. So that was really interesting too. And so playing around with the different guns and having the different guns to play around with taught me a lot about myself as a shooter. I found out that I really need to be careful about the sights that I choose. That's a real big issue, it turns out, for me. I also found out that the way that I grip the gun is a whole lot more important than how the gun feels. Now granted, a gun can be so uncomfortable that you really can't get a good grip on it at all. It's definitely possible for a gun to be too uncomfortable. But I also found out that just because a gun happens to be comfortable doesn't mean it's going to shoot well for you. Okay? A comfortable grip and an effective grip are not the same thing. Then with guns that I was able to get identically good scores, and both of them score very well for me, found out that the trigger pull is not that big of an issue. How heavy the trigger is doesn't really matter. How you pull the trigger matters, but how heavy the trigger is, not that big of an issue if you're talking practical defensive distances and defensive kind of accuracy. Now, if you're trying to hit the bullseye at 50 yards or something like that, and I usually don't shoot nearly that far, then yeah, I would want a little bit lighter trigger, or maybe even a significantly lighter trigger. And when I was first starting out, having that really light trigger really was a nice thing, and that it helped compensate for my own inadequacies. But once I figured out what I was doing, I can rock a 10 to 12 pound trigger that is really stagey and gritty. Not that big of an issue, it turns out. And then one last thing that I found out that kind of incidentally is that the weight distribution of the gun turns out to be fairly important. CZP-09, I can get great scores with it. Okay, just as good as I do with the PMR-30, the very light recoiling gun. Fantastic scores with it. CZ-75, not so great. And what's interesting about these two guns is they shoot the same caliber, they're both 9mm, and they weigh nearly the same. Both of them weigh 32 point some odd ounces, and the some odd chain is different for each one, but still, basically 32 ounce guns, unloaded of course, but pretty much the exact same weight, but the weight distribution is very different with them. And the CZ-75 Compact, it has a full steel frame and slide. And that slide is of course very thin. And so what that means is that it doesn't actually have most of the weight. Most of the weight is in the body of the gun, not in the slide. And so when the round goes off, there's recoil of course that sends the slide coming back, but the slide doesn't weigh very much, and so it doesn't actually absorb very much recoil. It gets to the end of its travel and actually has a lot of energy left over, and so what it will tend to do is will tend to flip the gun. I'm recoil sensitive. A gun that flips in my hand, even if it's heavy enough to stay in the hand, and this is a fairly heavy gun so it does stay in the hand, but it does tend to flip quite a bit. For me, psychologically, that's a huge issue. I feel like the gun is out of control. Now, like I said, this gun is heavy enough, it's not going anywhere, but I still don't feel like I'm in control which means that all the problems associated with recoil sensitivity manifest themselves. I tend to see a lot more shot anticipation with this gun and problems like that. And a lot of it has to do with the weight distribution. Not very much weight is in the slide, which means that once the slide has traveled back, there's still a lot of energy left over, and it's going to pull up on the muzzle. So this one, because I'm recoil sensitive, tends to be a bit of an issue. My P09, on the other hand, it's also, like I said, about a 32-ounce gun, but it's a polymer frame. And so the main weight of the gun is not in the frame. Instead, most of it is in the slide. And so when the slide comes back, most of the energy has already been absorbed by the mass of the slide and by, of course, the recoil spring going back. And so it doesn't tend to flip as much. And you will also notice that this one has a tilt barrel. Technically, the other one did as well, but it doesn't intend to flip nearly as much. It has a tilt barrel, but it doesn't tilt very much. This one, it tilts quite aggressively. Well, when a handgun recoils, it's going to tend to go back and up. Well, this one, the part that goes up moves independently of the part that moves back. So the felt recoil that I'm getting on my end, just in the handle, is mostly back. The part that moves up is moving up independently. So it doesn't tend to flip as much, and also because the slide is so heavy, that's where most of the recoil absorption happens. So this gun, even though it weighs pretty much exactly the same as the other one does, it manages the recoil a lot better. So, going over the things that I found work for me. When I first started with handguns, something that was very light recoiling, 22 Magnum, with a very crisp trigger, helped me out a lot. I was able to get hits where I didn't get hits before, and granted, rimfire guns are not overly effective and not overly reliable, but I could actually get hits with them. And for you, when you're first starting out, having something that you can get hits with is a whole lot better than not. And then you can start playing around with it. You can try different grips out. You can maybe have something that has adjustable sights or sights that you can trade out. Start figuring out what works for you and apply that across the board. So first of all, something that's light recoiling with a crisp trigger can be a really great training aid to get you to a higher level of skill so that you can deal with the real guns more effectively. But in the meantime, it's nice to have something that you can actually get hits with. Okay, very significant morale booster having something that you could actually aim at the target and hit the target with. That's a good thing. But from that, from playing around with that and figuring out what worked better and what worked less well, found out that a comfortable grip and an effective grip are not the same thing. Just because a gun is comfortable does not mean that you're going to be able to get an effective grip on it. So I had to find a grip that worked for me. Okay, and had to find guns that I could get that effective grip on. It doesn't mean they're comfortable, but it means it works for the way that I grip the gun. So I had to figure out, had to have a different definition of what a good grip was, basically. And it wasn't what was most comfortable. Now, granted, like I said, a gun can be so uncomfortable that it becomes a problem. But just because a gun is comfortable in the hand does not mean it's going to shoot well for you. Okay? Even my P09, it does not feel as good in the hand as my CZ75. It's not as comfortable. But I am able to get a more effective grip. Okay? So, figuring out the difference between a comfortable grip and an effective grip was important. Also, figuring out what kind of sights worked for me and what kinds of sights didn't was also a very big issue. And then, realizing that because I'm recoil sensitive, I need to look for guns that will handle a lot of the recoil for me. So guns that have very heavy slides in comparison to the rest of the gun. And, if possible, getting guns that have a fairly aggressive tilt on their barrel really helps me out a lot. Okay, now, is that necessarily going to be equally applicable to all of you guys? Maybe not, but I think that there is a lot of that is transferable. Okay, so, major takeaways. Please do not assume that just because a gun is comfortable and because you like the trigger pull, that it's going to be a good gun for you. That is not always the case. Sometimes it is, but it's not always the case, and it certainly wasn't in my case. CZ75, very comfortable gun, and the trigger pull is not bad. But ironically, the gun that I'm best with is not the most comfortable, and the trigger pull on it is absolutely terrible. But I'm still better with this than I am with any other gun. And why? Good sights, good recoil management built into the gun, and I can grip it in such a way that I can manage the recoil. It has an effective grip. Not a comfortable grip, but an effective grip. And as far as things that don't really matter, the big thing that I would say that does not matter as much as you might think it does is the trigger pull. Like I said, 10 to 12 pound trigger pull, 2 to 3 pound trigger pull, I get the same scores on paper with each of them. Trigger pull is not that big of a thing once you learn how to work around it. To start off with, you might need a gun with wider trigger pull just to get hits on target. But once you learn how to pull the trigger, it's not so much about how heavy the trigger pull is, but how you pull the trigger. It really becomes kind of a non-issue when you're talking about defensive distances and defensive accuracy. Like I said, if you're competition shooting and you're trying to hit that bullseye at 50 yards, yeah, light trigger pull, probably not a bad idea. But in a defensive situation, not actually all that necessary, it turns out. For defensive distances and defensive accuracy, not that big of an issue. Okay. Just my experiences. And when I went and finally got myself a subcompact gun, this is a gun that has a barrel between 3 and 3.5 inches, and that's about as small as I would recommend a gun that you get. I took everything that I learned about myself and put it into this gun. For one, it has good sights. It has a nice deep notch in the back. The front sight is fairly high off of the gun, at least in comparison. And the white dots that are on there I can pick up pretty easily, especially the front one. The front one has a really big white dot. Okay, so I learned that about myself. And the grip, not overly great, but I learned the difference between an effective grip and a comfortable grip, and I can make it work for me. And then the slide on this gun, in comparison to the rest of the gun, is very heavy, and it has a very aggressive tilt barrel. It definitely tilts. And so the gun is going to manage a lot of the recoil for me with that heavy slide and a fairly aggressive tilt on the barrel. And so when you guys look for guns, I would suggest that maybe some of those concerns might be good to look at. Okay, don't think in terms of how comfortable the gun is, but how effective you are with the grip. And like I said, we're going to do another video in which we talk about grip in a lot more detail. Because like I said, comfortable grip and effective grip are not the same thing. So don't, when you go to pick out a gun, don't say, oh, this is comfortable, therefore it's going to shoot well. That is not necessarily true. It may be true, not necessarily true. Also, don't look at the gun and say, oh, well, this has a really nice light trigger pull, so it's going to be good. It might be, especially if it's a relatively light recoiling gun, but that's more of an issue of how you pull the trigger. Trigger weight is not nearly as important as how you pull the trigger. Okay. More effective things to look for is a good set of sights, making sure that the slide has most of the weight of the gun, and if you have a tilt barrel design, make sure that that barrel tilts pretty aggressively once you open up the gun. Those would be my suggestions based on the fact that I have vision problems and I'm recoil sensitive. If you don't have vision problems and you're not recoil sensitive, that really opens up the scale quite a bit. And then looking at things like trigger pull and those kinds of issues might be more important. But from what I've seen shooting alongside a lot of different people, a lot of people actually kind of share some of the same attributes as I do. Not in the same extent, but a lot of them tend to do a lot better when they have guns that fit those criteria. You can get an effective grip, not a comfortable grip. The slide is heavier than the frame. The barrel tilts, and they have a good set of sights. Those are really good things to start with and to look for. Like I said, they're not equally applicable to all people, but it's not a bad thing to start looking for. And then, like I said, once we do that video talking about grip, you'll have a better idea of what I mean by effective grip versus comfortable grip. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Bye-bye.